There are dozens of webinar service providers out there, and all of them do roughly the same thing.
This video is brought to you by EpiPies Academy.
You might want to look at the specific details of a provider to find out which one is for you. And first, if you're new to webinars, let me define what a webinar service provider is. A webinar service provider essentially provides the connection between you and your audience. Generally, they have a centralized way for your audience to sign up for the webinar and then to view the webinar. You essentially send your audio and video from your computer to the webinar service provider. Then that webinar service provider will serve that audio and video in real time to your entire audience. They'll provide a specific URL for them to view the webinar. The one that I happen to use is called GoToWebinar. This is one of the oldest webinar service providers, and I think it's a good one. However, you certainly could convince me that others are just as good and provide more features that might be useful to you. The webinar service provider does not market your webinar. They essentially take you through a process in which you will create the webinar. So let me show you how that works in my particular provider. I'm going to sign in. And once I've signed in, you go to a dashboard. Now, yours webinar service provider may not work exactly this way, but it's going to have a similar process attached to it. So I'm going to click the schedule button, and then I'm going to schedule the webinar. Now, it needs some basic information here. The event title. Some people think this is a throwaway. I think the event title is really important because you want this to engage your audience. So for my event title, I'm going to say, learn to code in Python. Write your first lines of code in just 30 minutes. The idea here is I'm giving them a compelling reason to come. Generally, you'll select whether the event is live or recorded. Generally, I do my webinars live. I don't do a lot of recorded webinars. When does the webinar occur? Now, this is something people don't think about a whole lot, but you're going to want to think about where your audience is physically located. If your audience is located heavily in the United States and you do something at 3 p.m. New York time, well, the whole country basically is going to be at work, unless maybe you're targeting high school students after school. You've got to think about a date and a time that makes sense for the people who are going to attend your webinar. If your clients or your audience are people at work, specific businesses, you're doing B2B, you might want to schedule it during work time. And then, of course, time zone. This causes more confusion than just about anything else I know of in webinars, is people making a mistake with the time zone. So you want to be very careful when you set the time zone to make sure that you're consistent with using that time zone for everybody. All right, so once I've got that in my software, we can go ahead and schedule the webinar. We've got our name, live occurs once, date and time. And now we can schedule the webinar. And now the webinar is scheduled, and I can add to the description, etc. But when it comes time for the webinar to occur, I'm simply going to click the start button. And then the webinar provider is going to take over and provide the software that actually runs the webinar. Hopefully I'll be able to show you that in just a quick second here. So this is the GoToWebinar control panel. And this essentially is how I control the webinar using my webinar system or software. And generally all of them have something similar. Here I can see exactly what the users are seeing. I have some information about who's attending. The audio controls, you can see there that it's detecting my built-in microphone, whether or not I'm using my webcam, and then questions or polls I may have set up for the webinar itself. So that in a nutshell is what your webinar service provider does. And again, GoToWebinar is the one I use. I'm not recommending or endorsing it. You will need to select from a number of them. Another popular one is called Big Marker. And again, though, they all do relatively the same thing. You've got to sort through the different features and figure out what exactly you need. And of course, the second factor is cost. GoToWebinar can be on the expensive side, just so you get an idea of the pricing. Their starter is $89 a month when billed annually. If we looked at that monthly, $109 a month. I have the Pro plan, up to 500 participants, which is $250 a month. And if you have really large webinars, you need the Plus plan, which is $500 a month. Now, don't get too worried if you're just getting started. You don't have to use GoToWebinar. There are other webinar providers that actually have free plans or very low cost plans. So cost and features are something you're going to have to sort out when you choose your webinar service provider. Once you do, though, you're going to find that they have all the features you need to broadcast and control your webinar content.